Thank you for inviting me, and it is always a pleasure to be here. Anyone, am I hooked up here? Yes. Anyone who has walked the streets of great cities like Rome or Paris or London has experienced the extraordinary harmony that exists between buildings and the streets they form. Even the character of the street and the details of both great and ordinary buildings are always unique to that city. In great cities, the role of great architecture is indispensable. Think of Paris without the Eiffel Tower or Notre Dame Cathedral. Can you imagine Rome without St. Peter's or the ancient Roman Forum? Or London without St. Paul's Cathedral or the Houses of Parliament? These three great cities started life as Roman settlements, but cities in the New World also need great architecture. Consider Washington, D.C. without the Capitol, or the Lincoln Memorial, or the Washington Obelisk, or New York without the Empire State Building or the Statue of Liberty. Now, here is Paris today. The French wisely decided to keep new buildings outside of the city. Rome appears not to have changed because there are few new buildings in the heart of that great center. But then we come to London, and then we come to New York, or Shanghai, or that could be anywhere else in the world. One more, Shanghai. The question I'm laying before you is the following. At what point will our cities lose their identity and become part of a sameness that is everywhere? The older buildings and the great exemplars of architecture will be all that helps distinguish one place from another. And as we lose these, this will become increasingly difficult to distinguish one city from another until we will not be able to tell where we are in the world. This is the problem I'm setting out for you tonight. And it is a story that begins in New York in 1964. And it begins with an act of wanton destruction. 50 years ago, a rare and beautiful building was deliberately murdered. I use the word murdered because I believe that great architecture is alive and is also part of a greater living entity we call the city. In this case, the city of New York. Looking back, I sometimes find it hard to believe that the great Pennsylvania Railroad terminal is no longer there, that this magnificent creation was actually demolished. And it is only in the context of time past that I am able to fully appreciate the negative impact of this destructive act on the architectural culture of New York. Even though the new Penn Station, with its sports complex and offices, is now 50 years old, I still see the site between 7th and 8th Avenue as a raw and open wound, as the diminishment of the architectural aura and mythology of New York. However, with the benefit of hindsight, I've also become aware that this deplorable act had a major influence on my own life as an architect. The broader context in which this story takes place begins in August 1964. I was 25 years old and with my wife and two small children in tow, arrived at the United States from Scandinavia. My entry into this country was made possible by a student visa and scholarship to study at Yale University. For me, this was a dream come true, and although I had never before set foot in the United States, I felt as if I was coming home. These were golden years at Yale's architecture school, which had just moved into a new building designed by its brilliant young dean, Paul Rudolph. The Art and Architecture building at Yale had been featured on the cover of just about every important architectural journal in the world. Such was its impact that a young English architect, John Fowler, wondered in print in the Architectural Review whether the mantle of the recently deceased Frank Lloyd Wright had fallen on the shoulders of Paul Rudolph. Like so many other newcomers to these shores, I was most eager to visit the mythic city of New York. Compared to South Africa with its angry social and political divisions, the United States was a rare place. Its founding documents embodied the noblest aspirations of the modern world, as they still do. And New York, the city of skyscrapers, was the living embodiment of these ideals. And its skyline represented the purest manifestation of the 20th century. And it's interesting to note that if you look at the covers of books written in the 1920s by great European architects who visited the United States, they invariably have the skyline of New York on the cover. My first pilgrimage to Manhattan took place on a sunny Saturday morning in the fall of 1964. I boarded a train in New Haven, Connecticut, bound for New York. My destination was the great Pennsylvania Railroad station by McKim, Mead, and White. I had studied this building as a student in South Africa. Its forms and spaces entranced me. I spent so many hours poring over the plates in the great folio volumes of the firm's work that I was able to sketch the station's plans, elevations, and sections from memory. Stepping off the train in New York, I started to climb the long stair from the platform to the concourse level. Looking up, I realized the soaring glass vaults were so much higher and so much grander than I could possibly have anticipated. They defied gravity and appeared to float on air. My heart skipped a beat. This was nobler and more gracious than anything I had imagined studying drawings and photographs. I looked around. I wondered why the glass floors, which were so prominent in photographs of the building, had been covered over. They allowed light to penetrate down to the platform level and contributed to the pervasive sense of structural weightlessness. Although the concourse vaults covered an area larger than a football field, there was no ornament. It was an austere symphony of steel and glass. The railroad stations in London and Paris were simply large halls one walked through from train to taxi. Penn Station was a place in its own right. This vast interior, with its bustling crowds, was graced with a sense of effortless ease, which, in the words of the great historian and architect Fisk Kimball, seemed to exalt the visitor, and it felt American and somehow just right. But as I gazed around, I sensed that something was awry. Why was the vaulted roof covered in dust, and why were so many of the panes of glass cracked or broken? I followed the general flow of passengers through an archway of wondrous beauty into the general waiting room, enormous in scale. It is 150 foot high. This moving iteration of the baths of Caracalla of ancient Rome nonetheless seemed to float. This moving iteration is enormous in scale. Its vaults are 150 foot high, and they appear to float. Its monumentality was offset by the apparent weightlessness of this vault, aptly described by Fisk Kimball again as the civic vestibule to a great metropolis. It felt somehow noble yet comfortable and completely appropriate for a democracy. But on that day, as I walked around, I became increasingly uncomfortable. I noticed that part of the floor at one end of the room was being cut away, and the removal of the exquisite vault had begun. This vulnerable edge of the vault looked as delicate as tissue paper. I asked one of the workmen what was going on, and it was then that I learned that the building was being torn down. Within a few months, it would be transformed into a vast demolition site. I spent the rest of the day inside Penn Station. I felt impelled to experience all parts of the building, even those falling before my eyes and already in a state of ruin. I tried to engrave everything I could see on my memory, and I was very fortunate in finding the foreman of the demolition crew who listened to my sob story about coming from South Africa to see the building, and he took me through every corner of the building. I was lucky in a way because the building was being painstakingly unbuilt. The workers were carefully harvesting all the steel components, although the limestone blocks and the plaster were unceremoniously smashed. Over the next 2 years, I visited the site every time I came to New York. I observed the depressed taxiway on either side of the station being filled with debris, while the pedestrian bridges over them, which connected the general waiting room to the city sidewalks, were being reduced to rubble. I had particularly loved this dynamic way to accommodate vehicular and pedestrian traffic on different levels and solve the problems of bringing taxi to passengers directly to the train's concourse. And it all was done with so much more eloquence than any airport I've ever been in. Eventually, only a vague outline of the barrel-vaulted shopping arcade connected the waiting room to 8th Avenue. Over a period of months, everything was systematically reduced to piles of smashed stone. A group of carved eagles that had marked the roof cornice were being lined up on a pile of rubble like the spoils of a great battle set before a victorious emperor. Then as now, I believe that McKimmey & White's Pennsylvania Railroad Station was the firm's finest civic work. It still remains one of 2 buildings which stood out to me as quintessentially representing New York, buildings which could not possibly have been built anywhere else in the world. The other building is the gentlest and really the greatest skyscraper ever built, the Empire State Building, one of whose architects, Arthur Loomis Harmon, was an alumnus of the McKimmey & White office. 2 years after my first visit, Pennsylvania Station was gone. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan referred to this as, quote, the greatest act of civic vandalism in the city's history. Philip Johnson articulated it even more fully, saying, there never was another building like Penn Station. It compares to the great cathedrals of Europe. It is inconceivable that a 20th century city should have torn down such a patrimony. Penn Station's breathtakingly beauty embodied the highest aspirations of modern New York. Walking through its great vaulted rooms, which Kimball again described as soaring musical spaces, was unlike any other aesthetic experience in the 20th century. Penn Station was the city's greatest work of architecture. It was McKim's masterpiece. And irony of ironies, all the arrogant predictions of the building's obsolescence cited to justify its destruction proved wrong. Today, more than 10 times as many people pass through the station's portals each year as in 1960. And finally, the ultimate absurdity is that the new Penn Station proved to be inadequate to handle the passenger volume from the very first day it opened. The Chicago historian Carl Condit described the new station and the Madison Square Garden complex built on its air rights as a, quote, prime candidate for the most poverty-stricken architecture in New York. Indeed, it is questionable whether the structures can be regarded as architecture at all. Vincent Scully pithily noted that when Penn Station was there, one entered the city like a god. Now, one scuttles in like a rat. The fate of Penn Station spurred me to visit other McKim-Eden-White buildings in New York and in the small towns of New England. I became particularly interested in their shingle style and colonial revival houses. The extraordinary Low House was demolished in 1962, but the houses I did see were stunning displays of interior spatial continuity and craftsmanship. On the outside, the nearly symmetrical massing of the houses were offset by the asymmetrical placement of windows, dormers, and other features. Curiosity drove me to visit buildings by the next generation of architects who were inspired by McKim-Eden-White. These include architects like Charles Platt, Henry Bacon, and Bacon started out as McKim's assistant, and John Russell Pope, the first architect to study at the American Academy in Rome, which was McKim's creation. I also looked to the work of the previous generation, most particularly the extraordinary Henry Hobson Richardson, the teacher of both McKim and Stanford White. The buildings of these three generations remains the pinnacle of America's genius in architecture. For the first time in our nation's history, American architecture, through the work of McKim and Richardson, influenced architecture in England and Europe. As a consequence, visitors came from the United States and Europe, came to the United States from Europe and England to study our architecture, as well as our building codes, street lighting, libraries, schools, water supply, which were then considered to be the most advanced in the world. More than any other architects, McKim-Eden-White changed the ethos of American architecture. They moved away from the 19th century into the 20th and founded the American Renaissance movement, which embraced classical architecture and city planning. Now, in 1968, I had just started to teach at Yale, and I learned about Stanford White's library, built inside Thomas Jefferson's rotunda at the University of Virginia. At the time, very little had been written about this project. I soon decided to visit Charlottesville and couldn't wait to visit Jefferson's masterpieces, the Academical Village, and his home, Monticello. In 1895, Jefferson's rotunda, the University Library, together with Thomas Mills's later edition, was destroyed by fire. At the time, very little was made of this event, which was thought to be of local interest only. Today, of course, it would be regarded as a national catastrophe. Soon after, McKim-Eden-White were retained to rebuild this library. To my eye, Stanford White's work was masterful. By entering at the level of the portico floor, his library gained additional height and cohesion with its three-level high rotunda. Jefferson's library was raised up one floor above the entrance level and could only be accessed via a double via a double stair, which undermined the connection between the lawn, the rotunda, and the library. However, returning to the campus 7 years later, I was stunned to find that White's library had been demolished. It was replaced by an ersatz recreation of Jefferson's library interior. There are so few drawings in Jefferson's hand of what he intended for the library interior to be like, that the interior is really largely an invention of the so-called Restoration architect. The loss of a masterwork by Stanford White robbed us of the sparkling interchange between two of our greatest architects, Jefferson and White. Our third president imagined the rotunda functioning as the head, literally the brain of the campus, with its vast storehouse of knowledge housed in books. This brain presided over the anthropomorphic form of the academical village, with its outstretched arms open in a gesture of welcome. At some point in the late 1960s, the university decided to remove all parts of its library from the rotunda. And to this day, the rotunda remains empty. It's a room without a function. The form is retained, but the meaning has been lost. The symbolism was changed. From a brain, it now implies an empty head, or literally a brainless campus. Not a great symbol for a university. The loss of White's library at UVA was troubling. It slowly dawned on me that the demolitions of Penn Station and White's library were not isolated incidents. They were victims in an undeclared war against our older architectural and cultural heritage. This is not only in New York, but every other city, town, and campus throughout the nation. The intention of this war on our past was to irrevocably change the character of our cities by systematically replacing old buildings and neighborhoods with new, modernistic structures. Writing about plans to destroy Penn Station in 1963, the New York Times opined that we will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed. It is interesting, in an essay dealing with the destruction of particularly historic buildings during the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the contending parties in this war specifically sought out historic buildings and bridges, particularly the great bridge in the city of Mostar, which symbolized the harmony on the two sides of the bridge between the Muslims and the Russian Orthodox groups. And Chris Hedges, a war correspondent, in a book called War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, wrote the following about the destruction of important buildings. The destruction of culture plays a crucial role in the solidification of a wartime narrative. When the visible and tangible symbols of one's past are destroyed or denied, the past can be recreated to fit the myth. It is left only to those on the margins to keep the flame of introspection alive, although the destruction of culture is so often so great that full recovery is impossible. If demolition of a building in New York or in other places was not an option, architectural changes could be made to undermine the building's integrity. This is why we see the mutilation of older buildings by shearing off their cornices, or by introducing inappropriate muntinless windows and architecturally unrelated additions and alterations. Having witnessed the destruction of Penn Station, I was left confronting a question which nearly 50 years later continues to trouble me. Where did the impetus to destroy this vital building come from? What forces were driving this and other senseless acts of demolition? Our buildings describe who we are and what we believe in. Jefferson admonished, architecture is the preeminent embodiment of a nation's values. The old Penn Station connected our American Republic to the ancient Roman Republic, to the Renaissance, and to 2,000 years of Western civilization, to ancient Greece, and even to the world of the Hebrew Bible. What, we may ask, does the new Penn Station complex or the expansion of Rockefeller Center down 6th Avenue tell us about ourselves today, about our ideals, and about our values? The orgy of destruction I first experienced in the 1960s and 70s is still ongoing. It includes ordinary but urbane classical office, residential, and commercial buildings, as well as masterpieces like Penn Station or the New Haven Savings Bank by Henry Bacon, the architect of the Lincoln Memorial. Let me be clear, the demolition of ordinary buildings, and less often of great architecture, is not new. Pope Julius II sanctioned the pulling down of the old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which was built by the Emperor Constantine. And the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral approved the decision to replace the medieval cathedral, rather than renovate its fabric and reinforce its structure. But these two churchmen were confident that their architects, Donato Bramante and Sir Christopher Wren, were capable of creating new cathedrals that were worthy successors to the ancient structures they replaced. Marcel Breuer, a pupil of Gropius, a teacher at the Bauhaus, was given the commission to raise Grand Central Station and replace it with an office tower. This demonstrates what a highly regarded modern architecture proposed in a similar situation. The absurd consequence of this was that the Pan Am building, now the MetLife building, designed by a team led by Walter Gropius, which divides Warren and Wetmore's brilliant composition of Grand Central Station and the New York Central Office Tower. And it disrupts the view up and down Park Avenue. Today, we are apparently incapable of replacing even very ordinary buildings with worthy and gracious structures. Degraded cities and campuses have replaced urban complexity and refinement. And nowhere is this change clearer than in Lower Manhattan. I arrived here in 1964 and this famous skyline was more or less intact. It hadn't yet been displaced by the insipid, characterless boxes we see today, which are totally divorced from the great city, which, after all, is their home. Writing in a very different context, Robert Alto reminds us that, quote, style is not merely a constellation of aesthetic properties, but it is the vehicle of a particular vision of reality. This is an apt description of the stakes in the confrontation between the classical and modernistic approach to architecture and urbanism. They present very different and often mutually exclusive visions of reality. It is painful to measure the negative impact of these clashing visions on the city of New York. The lost Manhattan skyline of the 1920s embodied the dynamism and aspirations of the 20th century. This sublime concatenation of skyscrapers incorporated the complex rhythms of jazz to create a totally new expression of classical ideals. And the key point of this is that this was an unspoken, unarticulated collaboration between different architects to create pyramidal-shaped buildings, which got smaller as the higher they went, and with these exuberant towers with decorative features at the top, which really spoke to the horizon. Penn Station remains the most powerful icon of what New York and New Yorkers have lost. It didn't go down without a fight. The foreman of the demolition crew commented that this is one hell of a rock-solid building, and went on to explain how difficult it was for the workmen to demolish such a beautiful building. I've always wanted to emulate McKim, Mead and White by creating a building so wonderful that it would be equally painful to demolish. The aesthetic diversity, the range, the quality of McKim's, Mead and White's work continues to dazzle me. The partners were dominant in the creation of both the shingle style and the colonial revival, and left us a wondrous legacy of poetic, elegant, and sometimes quirky houses. McKim played a central role in the creation of the American Academy and was at the forefront of the Renaissance and Roman revival of public architecture. He participated in the Chicago 1893 World's Fair, which provided the impetus for the City Beautiful movement and the renewal of city planning in the United States. And McKim, together with Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., was a key figure in the creation of the single most successful comprehensive urban plan in American history, the Macmillan Commission Report on the Future of Washington, D.C. Stanford White's genius as an architect overflowed into the interiors of his buildings. It was like an unstoppable force. The brilliance of his interiors has not really been fully appreciated, and the quality of imagination and the remarkable diversity displayed in his work is, in my opinion, equal to that of Robert Adam. But McKim, Mead and White's dominant legacy remains their architecture. They produced a seemingly endless stream of landmark buildings. Think of the Morgan Library, the Second Madison Square Garden, the National War College, Symphony Hall in Boston, which is still the most successful auditorium building in the United States, and some people think in the world. The Boston Public Library, the Newport Casino, the Johnson Gate at Harvard, and the University Club in New York, of which Le Corbusier, the great modernist, wrote, "In New York, I learned to appreciate the Italian Renaissance. It is so well done. It even has a strange firmness, which is not Italian but American." Truthfully, there never was another firm like McKim, Mead and White. When thinking about their work, we can often overlook the decorative elements of their buildings, or the stunning beauty of their moldings and their settings for public sculpture. A remarkable quality of their architecture, one I admire more and more, is the subtle balance between whole and part. From my first visit to Penn Station, I still recall the near perfection of the design of the stair, which brought the passengers from street level down to the general waiting room. You felt as if you were walking on air, as if an angel was carrying you down. Now, this is a clip which I'm not going to show you because it was put together on a Mac, and this is Microsoft equipment, and the two don't like each other. But Hitchcock's movie, Strangers on the Train, has a central piece which is set in Pennsylvania Railroad Station, in the great waiting room. And here you see Farley Granger, the hero, coming down the steps of Penn Station, these amazing steps which were 4.5 inches high and nearly 20 inches for their treads. After the untimely death of Whitey in 1906 and McKim 3 years later, next slide, the firm still flourished, albeit at a lesser level of intensity, creating the Manhattan Municipal Building, the Racquet and Tennis Club, which faces the great Seagram's building by Mies van der Rohe, and the Bronx Grit Chamber. Studying McKim Eden White's houses and living in a 1740 Connecticut farmhouse impelled me to learn about colonial and federal, as well as other 19th century buildings. Understanding American architectural history became a focus of my life as an architect. There was nothing systematic about my exploration, but I was particularly interested in the English architectural roots of colonial American architecture, which was an adaptation to a new cultural and physical conditions in the American colony. I also started to study the history of the United States and our political system. Given that Washington and Jefferson were such great architects and virtually created our federal style of government architecture, I wanted to learn if there were connections between America's architecture and our founding documents and our democratic system of government. 3 decades later, my thought on the subject were distilled in 2 books, George Washington Architect and The Architecture of Democracy. In 1968, I was surprised to be appointed to the visiting faculty at the Yale School of Architecture and determined to use my classes to demonstrate to both graduates and undergraduate students the importance of contextual design and the role of history in architecture and city planning. My work with students, especially those in Yale College, was joyous. Dealing with the more closed-minded faculty was much less rewarding, and I resigned in 1975. And it is still true that a colleague of mine once described the architectural faculty in most schools, and definitely not this university, as intellectual fascists who would simply not tolerate anything with which they were not in agreement and which threatened the basis of their knowledge. Around this time, I was having lunch at the old Dorset Hotel with Arthur Drexler, Director of Architecture at MoMA. His sage counsel to me was, forget teaching. An architect's legacy can only be a few great buildings. And this advice pushed me into confronting the most momentous decision of my life as an architect. Should I be a classical or a modern architect? Having been trained in both in South Africa, this choice was less a plunge into the unknown than the assessment of which set of architectural ideals would be the most challenging and therefore the most satisfying. At the time, my first 2 buildings in the United States were nearing completion. A small addition to a 17th century house was inspired by Stanford White's shingle style. It was my first classical building. The other was an addition to the 1910 Connecticut State Library and Supreme Court building. Designed in '69 but not completed until 1975, my addition was inspired by Alto. I remain proud of this building, but to my eye it seemed to lack the intensity of conversation that occurred, say, between Charles Platt and Ernest Flagg at the Corcoran Gallery of Washington, D.C. I chose to become a classical architect, a decision I have never regretted, because the yardstick used to evaluate my work would be the greatest architecture of the past. To most architects and friends, except Arthur Drexler, Philip Johnson, and Henry Hope Reed, this was an absurd decision. Older practitioners, some of whom spent their last years working for Modernists, warned that my decision was professional suicide, giving the near impossibility of realizing classical architecture in the world of the 1970s. I was guardedly optimistic and hoped I would be able to create a small office and make sufficient money to support my family of 5 children. At the time, I knew of no other full-time classical architect practicing anywhere in the United States. During the 1970s, 3 events occurred that were of importance to my practice. The first, in 1971, was my decision to invite Henry Hope Reed, the founder of Classical America and author of The Golden City, to lecture to my Yale students. The dramatic juxtapositions of new and old in his book, written in 1959, remain more pertinent today than when the book was written. And generously, Henry introduced me to John Barrington Bailey, who was later to design the beautiful one-story addition to the Frick Museum. They shared a vision of classical America, which found voice in their journal, Classical America, which was a beacon of hope. The second event was the landmark a Museum of Modern Art exhibition in 1975 of the 19th century work of students at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. This hugely successful exhibition stunned the architectural world with its display of large watercolor presentations by young French students who were in their late teens, and went on to become some of France's greatest architects. This group included Charles Garnier, who designed the Paris Opera House, Henri Lebrouste, Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, and Félix Dubin, who designed the École des Beaux-Arts. Its impact on the public was to open minds to the possibility of new classical buildings. The third event occurred at the end of the 1970s. This was the exhibition I co-curated with Arthur Drexler at MoMA. It was the first retrospective anywhere of the work of the English architect Sir Edwin Lutyens, who died in 1944. Although the show was modest in scale, seeing his 20th century classical buildings on display at MoMA inspired both young and architects and the general public to imagine a renaissance of classical architecture. Around this time, the very idea of modern classical architecture seemed to be so outrageous that I was actually considered a radical. When asked to lecture to a state chapter of the American Institute of Architects, I was told by the organizers that fairness demanded a modernist have equal time to reply to my presentation. Here was I, a lone architect who needed a part-time job to feed my family. Why, I wondered, was the rich and powerful AIA so worried? The answer is because of the power of ideas. However, all this positioned me in a very helpful way as a member of an avant-garde of one. My Manchester courthouse was completed in 1978 and was widely published. Soon after, I was asked to design a new house for a young family and their extraordinary expanding art collection. It was to be based on Mount Vernon. And argue as I might, this was a non-negotiable condition. I soon learned that many earlier architects, including McKim White and John Russell Pope, had received similar requests from their clients. Because Washington, and these two architects chose to render their Mount Vernons as symmetrical buildings. Mount Vernon, as most of you know, is an asymmetrical building. Because Washington's design is so resolved and so perfectly integrated into its garden, I found that my design was a real uphill battle. I sweated over the drawing board. Given that the asymmetry of Mount Vernon was a feature Washington clearly wanted to keep as a holdover from his elder brother Lawrence's design, one could either follow Stanford White and the Theodate Pope Riddle House and design an asymmetrical building with a big bay window on one side and exaggerate this quality, or design symmetrically like Pope and McKim White. As my design evolved, I set the windows so that they were not lined up one above the other. Rather, they line up along opposite edges, so that with the shutters open, it creates a serpentine pattern across the facade, and each half of the front facade is in fact asymmetrical. On the south side, I have 5 bays, not 7, and used round rather than Washington square columns. The broad proportion of the Tuscan order creates a more muscular facade. My practice started to grow. Slowly, a retail project, academic buildings, Tercentenary Hall at William and Mary, and an industrial commission. That is the Athens, Georgia Banner Herald and Daily News building. I also received a very unusual request to design a large area of the State Department into a new suite of offices for the Secretary of State, George Shultz, and this is his waiting room, and including a suite of rooms for signing treaties. Until this time, the State Department signed over 400 treaties a year, and they never had a room to do this in. So Secretary Shultz set space aside for this purpose. This commission established my firm on a more solid foundation. It was only possible because it was paid for by privately raised funds and short-circuited the dull hand of the GSA. I was living my dream. My house practice continued to evolve during the 90s. Other commissions included university buildings, Rice University, offices in London, and a retail building in Los Angeles. The latter used an unusual prefabricated construction system and exploited the marvelous climate of Southern California with outdoor terraces. The 21st century has brought new challenges, including a large farm. This is Martha Stewart's Cantato. Academic and science buildings. This is a nanotechnology laboratory at the University of, God, I can't remember, sorry. I was going to say University of Denver, but it's not. And houses of very different characters. The wonderful difference is that now I have to compete for every job against brilliant young architects. And I say wonderful because the growth of classical architecture now exceeds the limits of my wildest dreams. Our work opportunities continue to multiply as the influence of our ideas evolves and grows. But I continue to mourn the loss of Penn Station. Looking back, I now understand that the engine driving my decision in 1975 to become a classical architect was born amid the rubble of New York's noblest building. The destruction of Penn Station was a mindless act. It was this very quality of mindlessness that propelled me to move in the opposite direction, to strive to connect architecture with the world of the mind, to the world of history, and to the world of the educated imagination. Despite the passage of half a century, I recall as if it was yesterday that beautiful sunny day in New York when I stood amid the ruins of Penn Station, determined to engrave its forms onto the deepest recesses of my imagination. I did not feel alone on that day, for I could feel the distraught and barely discernible shadow of Charles Follen McKim standing beside me. And with McKim as one of our guides, I hope to help restore architecture to its rightful place as the basic building block out of which cohesive cities, which express our local culture, geography, and climate, are going to be built. Thank you. Anybody have any questions? Well, I've convinced everybody. Well, you have to be nice to your hosts. Pardon? Yes. Yes.
How is your firm structured in the sense that some of the buildings look large and complex? Do you produce all of the construction documents or do you partner with other firms?
Does my firm produce all of its drawings, even for large and complex buildings? The answer is my one foray into collaborative work with an associated firm was really a battle, very, very difficult. So since then, I haven't done that. We do everything in-house. And our office is organized vertically so that the team who starts the building is the team who finishes it. Structuring it the way most offices are, with a design department, a construction drawing department, and a site administration department, I think is a catastrophe, because it's been shown many times that building failures can usually be traced back to situations in which the people who check the shop drawings are not the people who designed the particular parts of the building that failed. Yes? My God. Well, I was in Paul Rudolph's last class, so I had, oddly enough, an amazing relationship with him. Paul Rudolph was the only faculty member at Yale who would come into the studio after 5 o'clock. He usually closed his office at 11, 12, 1 a.m. and would then wander half a block to the A&A building and see who was working in the studio. And because I had children and helped with them during the day, all my work was done at night in the studio. And so I was invariably there, and we spent hours just talking together. And Rudolf, in the spring of 1964, was the only architect and or even architectural historian who would have looked at my drawings for this particular project and seen courtyards and said, Allan, have you walked through the courtyards of Yale College? And I said, no, sir, I haven't. And he sat down and drew me a map of the university with a dotted trail telling me how to walk home from the architecture school through all the college courtyards to the married student housing, which he designed on the hill, which I did. And of course, the Yale courtyards are amazing. I actually would go so far as to say they're more beautiful than many of the Oxford courtyards. So I continued to revere the man, and I was one of the few people that came to his birthday celebration on the top floor of the UN building in early 90s, just about a year before he died. And I gave him that 1995 monograph on my work with a long inscription. Rudolf was always, he didn't care what your vocabulary was. It was just a question of whether it was good or bad. And I think he designed his architecture school to awaken the architectural imagination. The building was a bare bones spatial experience. But unlike, say, the Bauhaus building, which leaves me quite dead, whereas I love the buildings of Le Corbusier, Rudolph's architecture school had this electric energy going through it. And even when these cargo nets, which were the curtains, sort of molted every morning on your drawing board, it didn't really matter. It was spatially so exciting. And there were these plaster casts of Greek sculptures everywhere. You could see the Panathenaic Procession from the Parthenon as you climbed up this open staircase. On each level, there was a different part of this, and you looked at it in a way that the ancient Greeks would have had to look up at a very steep angle. You actually saw it head on, and you could see all the distortions the sculptor had made to recognizing that his work would only be seen at a very acute angle. And I loved the little seminar rooms in the corner because Rudolph's method of teaching was to say, to his walking around the studio, he would say, class, Allan has a problem with his design. Let's go into the room, pin it up, and then maybe you guys can help him. And he'd pin up the drawings and sort of shred them. And then using not his advice, but the advice and comments of students, which he would somehow elicit, he helped you find a new pathway to what you were trying to achieve. And as is indicated by the man showing up in the studio at 1 a.m., he was just totally and utterly committed to architecture. And all of his students left architecture school with the conviction that architecture was a noble profession and that an eighth of an inch could be the difference between a good and a bad building. You were all imbued with the notion that this was a noble profession, which didn't last very long. Charles Moore took over the school, and Charles Moore was into, how can I describe it? Touchy-feely. I mean, they had Yale College and undergraduates who were among the smartest 18-year-olds in the world, walking from New Haven Railroad Station to downtown New Haven and Yale with a notebook, sort of collecting autumn leaves and pasting them and sort of noting what they see and what their ideas were. There was the school and the building were at totally opposite extremes. Charles Moore thrived in parties which he gave for students in his house, and lectured he'd show 100 slides of fountains, but with no analysis at all. And he would have the first year class sitting in a circle, sort of exchanging ideas, or as you would put it in the current 60s terminology, rapping. It was just so different, and the school grated on him until it was burned down. Now, the changing character of the architecture school, I can give you by an example. When Eero Saarinen died, and his estate was being sorted out, his widow, Aileen, gave the architecture school all his diaries, everything related to his office. I mean, they had all his car keys and his office keys, plus must have been 40 folios from the Saarinen office, including, some had the labels of the library of Eliel Saarinen and the library of Eero Saarinen. And these were given to the architecture school. They stayed in Charles Moore's office for 9 months until the fire, after which I bought them for $25 at a Yale library sale. The books were not seen to have any value at all, so they very happily ensconced in my library. But they were such extreme personalities. You couldn't imagine Moore thriving in Rudolph's school and Rudolph thriving in a school that Charles Moore designed. As to Charles Guthrie and Bob Stearns' addition to the Yale Library, that's sad. That's all I can say. And it is really sad. It's like putting a lamb in the same cage as a cheetah. Rudolph's building really has a barbaric edge. If you fall against the concrete structure, you can shred your arm. It's dangerous. And the architecture was basic. I think Gropius wanted the Bauhaus building to be sort of a statement of fundamentals, but it isn't, because you're never quite sure what he's trying to say. Maybe the Villa Savoir is more a statement of fundamentals. But Rudolph took it to the nth degree. This was space, these were walls, these were floors, and had a textured ceiling, a different texture on the walls, polished concrete floors, and orange-colored carpet everywhere. It was, I thought it was amazing. I loved every minute of the building. I think Charles Gwathmey and Bob Stern defanged the building. I mean, it's like an aged carnivore from the African jungle without claws, without teeth, and totally unthreatening. Long answer, I'm sorry.
Let's share a humorous part of Paul Rudolph. As the building was under construction, he came up with the idea of putting that conch shell embedded in the concrete wall. And a few years after that, I was picking him up at the airport and taking him to his mother's house in Atlanta. I said, I've often wondered why you put that conch shell. And he said, you had Venturi as a teacher when you were Yale. And I said, yes. He said, you remember how Venturi would talk about the inner and the outer skin? He said, I put that conch shell as a reminder of what Venturi was talking about, smoothness of that curl skin of the conch shell, and your description of rough concrete. And I love that story about why he did it, because I never could quite put Venturi and Rudolph together as they were in the school, both critics and the master's class. I was a few years ahead in that program, and did not live in that building, but watched it built. And I learned a lot about what spatial architecture is about because of the construction.
Yes, sir.
Many of us down here are among the great unwashed. And listening to your discussion about classical architecture, I'd be interested to hear you discuss the relevance of classical architecture versus modern architecture to our society.
I think what we call modern architecture is actually much more complicated than it's presented by critics and by architectural historians. I mean, to be truthful, the work of, say, Le Corbusier and of Alvar Aalto and of Mies van der Rohe have less to do with each other than they have to do with, say, a great classicist like Sir Edwin Lutyens, who was on a first-name basis with Frank Lloyd Wright and was much admired by Le Corbusier. In fact, Lutyens is the only architect, Le Corbusier, only contemporary architect Le Corbusier ever said anything nice about in print. So I think there is also a major difference between Wright and between Alvar Aalto and Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe and, say, what I call the school of Walter Gropius. Mies, Wright, and Aalto were all trained as classical architects. In every office Mies van der Rohe inhabited, from his move to Berlin in 1902 or 4, I don't remember, to his last office in Chicago, the only decoration he had in his personal office was an Ionic column, which he had drawn as a young man. He was a great student of Schinkel, and Le Corbusier's basic training was as a classical architect, as was Alvar Aalto's. And you can see Aalto's early buildings in Finland, which are quite beautiful. These very austere, simple brick classical churches and other buildings. I think this infused their architecture, right up to the time they died, with classical qualities, which are different from what I call the school of Gropius, and its manifestation in the United States in the work of, say, the Office of McKimby and White. They are producing what I call skin buildings. You can stand on Park Avenue in New York and look at Seagram's building, and you see a building with a grid of columns that you can feel going through the whole building. You look at the neighboring Lever House or other buildings, and they are buildings which are essentially skins. We call it a curtain wall. And you have no feel for what goes on inside the building, and you generally see the building as a package. There was a cartoon in the New Yorker of a guy standing wrapping a building in paper on which there was a facade printed. You sometimes feel with the SOM buildings in New York that the curtain wall actually goes up and covers the roof. I don't happen to like skin buildings. I don't see them as architecture, I see them as packages. The great modernists, like Alto and Mies, didn't do skin buildings. They did buildings which were infused with a three-dimensional sense of structure and a sense of anthropomorphism. I mean, the whole point of classical architecture, from the Greeks to Mr. Schutze, is that classical architecture is anthropomorphic. You have the cornice, which is a head. Every transition between materials has a molding on it. You have a cornice at the top, so you hide the junction between the wall and the ceiling because they expand differently. You usually get a crack there and you cover this. The floor, the baseboard around the floor is like a foot. A Greek column has emphases, sort of like this. Every Greek temple has different moldings. There is not one molding on any Greek temple which is repeated from another building. As just like column is a person, every person is different. When you look at the Parthenon, you see the citizens of Athens supporting the roof of Athena, Athena's home, because her shield defends the city. Same is true with the Lincoln Memorial. It's a citizen of every state. And it's anthropomorphic, and its architecture grew and developed to define cities, the streets of cities, and the hierarchy of buildings in cities, temples, government buildings, houses, etc., etc. And that was the basis of all Western architecture. To think that you can create a new architecture out of the Bauhaus, which was going to be as rich and create great cities like Venice and Rome and Paris, is a fallacy. You can't do it. I mean, truly, walking around the campus here, there are lots of new buildings. Some of them are nicer than others. You come across this building, it's like finding a great book in on a shelf of books in a library. It's a masterwork. And it maybe connects Atlanta to its past. And not only to Atlanta's past, but to the United States' past and to the history of Western architecture. Classical architecture can do that. Modern architecture can't. Critic once said that you can't find 4 corners on a city block anywhere in the United States designed by modern architects where one corner has anything to do with another. And the problem is our cities are just fragments, becoming an assembly of fragments of new buildings which have no relationship to the street, to the adjacent buildings, and all they do is tell you about, you know, John Smith or Jane Smith's ideas about architecture. I'm sorry, very depressing story.
There's an interesting parallel with your remarks about being trained as a classicist and learning the rules and then breaking them to the painter, Picasso, who was trained very much as a classicist, mastered the language, and then proceeded to break the rules. It's interesting to me that some of the architects that you cited as inspirational, watching mastered the classical language of the ancients, but broke the rules for a variety of reasons. And I wonder if you could comment about this relationship between the tradition that is based on rules and regulations and the ability and the flexibility that offers to breaking those rules.
Well, they aren't rules, they are conventions. It's a really important distinction. There are no rules. I mean, the first man to break the rules in Palladio's Quattro Libri is Palladio himself, and you only have to see this when you walk around and look at the buildings with his drawings. They are conventions, and like the conventions of the English language, they are meant to be stretched, to be broken, or to be rendered more eloquently. And that is the whole history of Western architecture. I mean, this is the same column the Greeks drew, but it's different. No Greek would walk into this building and say, oh yes, just like old Athens. They would, I mean, it's what I try to do in the State Department. I try to create rooms in which Jefferson would feel at home and say, yes, I understand this, but it's so different. You know, and I think he would be fascinated by our work today because it is so different, but uses the same language. It's like the difference between Henry James and James Joyce, or Charles Dickens, or Spencer. I mean, they all write, or Shakespeare, they all write in English. They all follow similar conventions, but the results are so different. I don't know if that answers your question. Oh, well, I think you are partially correct. I think that architecture from the ancient Greeks has always been interested in technology. The Romans built differently from the Greeks, faster and cheaper. That's what architecture's all been about. I mean, people who say it's not innovative are just ignorant. the adoption of the steel frame was not a function of work coming out of Europe in the 1920s. It was people like Daniel Burnham and McKim Eden White and George B. Post and others in New York and Chicago who designed classical buildings, which were in fact steel-framed buildings. The mechanical movement of air through buildings, the adoption of air conditioning, the adoption of hygiene in hospital architecture. I mean, all this was part and parcel of being a classical architect. Street lighting. Light fixtures were designed by architects. The great bridges of New York had architects as well as engineers designing them. And I think the gulf between engineering and architecture and between architecture, engineering, and city planning is so vast today that the professions can barely talk to each other. But that's wrong. I think they should collaborate fruitfully with one another. As regards economy, I think that beautiful buildings always cost more money. Seagram's building doesn't cost more. But even Mises much cheaper, skyscrapers, tall buildings in and around Chicago and Detroit and other places, probably cost a little bit more. But I don't think money is a problem in the United States. It's made into this huge issue because really we have been taught that there is always a cheaper way. I mean, perhaps we can go to China and learn about shoddier ways of building than we adopt. But you just have to spend time in New York and you will see techniques of economy that defy the imagination. I mean, so much is made of what happened at 9/11. Well, the New York City Police Department and Fire Department still can't communicate with each other. The problem of fireproofing steel is done the same shoddy way today as it was done prior when the World Trade Center was built. The World Trade Center is a marvelous example of economy, of cheapness. They saved a bundle of money by building the fire stairs out of drywall, not out of concrete. I mean, had those planes flown into the Empire State Building, they would have bounced off. There would have been damage, but nothing, the building would not have fallen down. The fact that the World Trade Center fell down is just a tribute to its shoddy construction, to New York City's shoddy construction, or shoddy. They don't police the building code very well, and the government entity that built the World Trade Center didn't have to worry about building codes. They just built it the way they wanted to. So I think economy is important. We don't like to waste money. But I think beautiful buildings, even though they may cost a little more, are well worth the money. My last thing I'm going to say is that there is a history of public housing in the United States and in Europe which is disgraceful. These buildings have been demolished in England, in France, and in the United States, the buildings of the late 20s and 1930s, because they were totally dehumanizing. Prior to that, from the United States entry into World War I, and 1925 or 1926, there is a history of housing projects for working class and poor, that most of those buildings still exist. Most of them have been sold by HUD to the residents as condominiums. And you can go down what is ironically named Iranian Avenue in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which is a great war productions center, and you will find a housing project called Sunnyside, which is like a little English village with serpentine streets and these brick Georgian houses. And the lesson of that is that poor people like to live in the same kind of houses as rich people, and they don't mind having less space. But thank you.